Morning. It's certainly a great privilege to be back together, to worship God, to encourage one another, and in fellowship with the Lord. What a wonderful week we had this past week with our gospel meeting. Brother Ernest Benjamin did such a wonderful job on the lessons that he did. Very thankful to have been able to sit at his feet for a little while, but someone asked me this morning, do you still remember how? I don't know. We'll see. Do enjoy the opportunities we have to study the Word of God together. And if you're visiting with us, we want you to know that you're welcome and wanted right here at the Brighton Church of Christ. If you're looking for a church home or a church family to identify with, a group of people that love God and will love you and help you to get to heaven, you need to look no further than right here at the Brighton Church of Christ. We would encourage you, if you've not already done so, to fill out the visitor's card from the pew in front of you there. You can just pass that to one of the members here, and they'll make sure that it gets to the right person. We've been engaged now for several weeks, after our pause, of course, last week, but in the study of the book of Colossians, and what a great letter this is. In fact, it is one of Paul's great prison epistles, and in this particular case, the theme of the letter really is about Christ. In fact, you have one of the most precious Christ hymns of all of Paul's Christ hymns, where he exalts Christ to the highest point, that in everything he might have preeminence, Paul would say in chapter 1 and verse 18. But that influence of Christ, that effect of Christ, is something that continues throughout the entirety of the letter. It is one of Paul's great themes in all of his writings, but here in Colossians it seems to be taken to its highest degree in comparison to all the other writings of Paul. It was in 1945 that theologian and author C.S. Lewis wrote an essay that appeared in a newspaper that was titled "The Sermon and the Lunch." He tells of sitting and listening to a preacher sermonize on the home. According to him, the preacher went on to say, the home must be the foundation of national life. It is there, all said and done, that character is formed. It is there that we appear as we really are. It is there that we retreat from the noise and the stress and the temptation and the dissipation of daily life to seek sources of fresh strength and renewed purity. It's great ideas about the home. But Lewis goes on to say that he told of having lunch with that same preacher and his family later that day, and that the two children, who were young adults at the time, had joined them. And so it was this family of four, and he is sitting there, and he said the lunch was a flurry of condescension, anger, egotism, interruption, and ignorance, which caused Lewis to realize he was seeing the preacher and his wife as they really were. He spends the rest of the essay lamenting the idealized version of the home as this tranquil perfection that many preach and strive for, and that impossible ideal frustrates so many when they fail to attain it. It's quite an interesting thought coming from a man who loves God and recognizes that the home is not as peaceful and tranquil sometimes as it is idealized to be, is it? If you've ever woke up late, scrambled to get the kids dressed, breakfast on the table, to get to a place, whether it's school or work or somewhere else, at a particular time, you know how hectic life itself can be. Lewis concluded that there are 5 truths about the home that ought to be taught when we're speaking about the home. As with every institution, he says, the home does not have a tendency to go rightly. Why? He says, because it too suffers attack from Satan. We say that about our works, we say it about church, we say it about friendships and relationships. We must also say it about the home. The home does not have a tendency to just go rightly. It takes work. That led him to his second conclusion, that strong families need more than love. With apologies to the Beatles, it takes more than just love. It takes a dedication. It takes a daily attention to details about what family life, according to the gospel, really is. And while love is certainly a glue that would hold us together, Ephesians 4 and verse 15, it takes more than love. It takes an understanding and a knowledge and a wisdom. It takes effort. It doesn't always go easily. And then he was talking about this idea that the preacher mentioned, that it is there at the home that we allow our true selves to come out. Lewis says that revealing our true selves in the home is a great pitfall if our true selves are ugly. And sometimes our true selves are ugly. Sometimes as Christians we dress up like an onion, layer upon layer upon layer of what we want others to see. And when we get home, we begin to peel away the layers, and what's left at the core of our Christian lives is ugly. This led him to his fourth conclusion, which Lewis said, it will never be lawful simply to be ourselves until ourselves become sons of God. Until God in His grace wraps our lives and guides us, as Ivan used this morning in his Bible class, for me to live is Christ, until it truly is Christ in our lives, living in us, then it's not lawful for us to simply be ourselves. We look at our lives, we ask that question, what did simply being yourself get you to this point? And if we're honest, we know that we're sinners. Each and every one of us, because of the choices that we've made. But I like his fifth conclusion. If the home is to be a means of grace, it must be a place of rules. The alternative to rule is not freedom. A lot of people say, oh, I want freedom. No rules, I want freedom. But Lewis concludes that the alternative to no rules is not freedom, but it is really tyranny of the most selfish member of the household. Have you seen that in your life or in the lives of others? Maybe a wife or a husband is extremely selfish. The family is damaged because the rules are all bent toward that one person. Sometimes it's the children even. And Lewis says the house must have rules. That's where we find ourselves in the book of Colossians in chapter 3 and verse 18. Paul continues his address of how Christ affects and impacts our lives by our focus on Jesus Christ. And that brings us to the Christ home. What does the Christ home look like? This section of Scripture is often referred to as the house tables or the household codes, which contains important rules for how the household is to live. In other words, Paul is saying, in order to have a house or a family that brings glory to God, there must be rules. We follow those rules. We have to follow those rules, not in order to be saved. We have to follow those because we're saved by the grace of God. We have to follow those rules to keep ourselves from being lost again. Because if we don't follow it, we bring shame and dishonor to the God that we say we serve. And so in this section, Paul focuses on three pairs of household members: the husband and wife, the parents and the children, and the master and the slaves. And he follows a formula in each part. He begins with the weaker half, and then he goes to the stronger person. Then he begins with each one an address to them, and then followed by an exhortation of what he wants them to do, and then he concludes with a motivation why you should do it. Let's begin with the husband and wife in chapter 3, verses 18 and 19. Wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. In our modern generation, this command is hated, ignored, because it runs contrary to the feminist philosophy that permeates our society today. It is assumed that this teaches that women are inferior to men, similar to Peter's statement when he calls the women the weaker vessel. See, that means that women are inferior, so we've got to toss out Paul, we've got to toss out Peter. Well, you might as well toss out the Bible and God and Jesus with it at the same time. Because if you cannot accept the commandments of Paul as commandments of the Lord, 1 Corinthians 14 and verse 37, there's no reason to go further. What Paul says here, he uses the word hupotasso. It's from the root word tasso, which means to order or to put things in line with. The prepositional prefix hupo means under, like where we get hypodermic needle. The word hypo or the prefix hypo means underneath. And so hypodermic means underneath the skin. Hypotasso means to be underneath something in order. And what it literally means is that we willingly align ourselves underneath someone else. That there is an order, a hierarchical order, and we willingly put ourselves in the place which God has designed. Now understand this. This command that Paul gives, in fact, he states it in the imperative, wives, submit to your husbands. This has nothing to do with the value or the worth of the one who's in submission. In Luke chapter 2 and verse 51, after Jesus had been left behind at the temple, and his parents go back to him and they retrieve him, it says that Jesus went down with his parents and came to Nazareth and was submissive to them. The word for submissive here is hupotasso, the very same word that is used in the imperative in Colossians 3 and verse 18. What this shows is Jesus' willingness to submit to the divine order, parents over children. It does not speak to Jesus' value or worth. When Jesus was submissive to his parents, at no point was he inferior in value or worth to them. In the same way, a wife that submits to her husband is not inferior in value or worth to her own husband. In fact, Paul's house table is a reflection of God's divine design. It shows God's consistency from creation, where man was created first, the woman was created for man, and the woman is the first to sin. In Genesis chapter 2 and verse 7, God created man. And in verse 18, he said, it's not good that man should be alone. So he brings forth a woman as a help meet for him, for man. Of course, those are appealed to in such places as 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 3 that says the head of every woman is the man. In 1 Corinthians 14 and verse 34 that the woman is to keep silent. In 1 Peter 3 verses 5 through 6 that she is the weaker vessel. And in 1 Timothy 2 and verse 14 why men are to pray in every place. Paul specifically says because Adam was created first and Eve was the first to sin. There is a consistency throughout the Bible of God's design. But at no point does this indicate that the woman is inferior in value or worth to man. Submitting, then, he finishes with the motivation, for this is fitting in the Lord. It is a following of God's design, and that is always the proper thing to do. You know, the world has many competing designs. Go take a class on sociology, anthropology, psychology. Seems every discipline, every field of study has its own design for what the family or the house should look like. But every one of them are inferior in value and worth to God's design and plan. Husbands, he goes on in verse 19. Husbands, love your wives. Again, in the imperative, this is a commandment. There were so many secular household codes. that were contemporary or even older than Paul's. This is not the only list of antiquity about how a household is to be run. It's almost as if Paul saw the landscape, the philosophical landscape that surrounded him that day, about how others said fathers and husbands and wives and slaves and masters, and everyone should behave within the family, within the household structure. And Paul says, well, it's time for us to give what Christ's design is. And that's certainly what he does. But what's interesting is these other household codes may emphasize the rule and organization of that household, and talk about the wife's place within that function. But Paul emphasizes that these codes are a result of Christ. And what's amazing is that not one single household code in all of the many that exist at that time, not a single one of them speaks of the husband's responsibility or obligations. This is the first one that mentions the husband. I know there's a lot of people who like to talk about Paul being chauvinistic, that Paul emphasizes the man and de-emphasizes the woman, that Paul simply doesn't follow feminist philosophy today. Well, he doesn't do that, but what's interesting is that Paul exalts women, even in this statement. And part of it is seen by the fact that he gives obligation to the husband when nobody else of his contemporary or even before him did. Men, you have an obligation to love your wives. He is to have a self-sacrificing dedication to the well-being of his wife. Think about the exemplar of love throughout the Bible is God. And he uses the same term that God uses over and over about his relationship to man, of love, love, love. And we speak highly of love. And that same high view of love is what is supposed to characterize the husband's relationship to his wife. Hence, the fullness of the husband-wife relationship requires both love and respect. The relationship isn't a master-slave type relationship. In fact, 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 15 tells us or proves that it never was a master-slave relationship. The husband's love keeps him from being harsh and domineering, demanding, or some commandant of the household. There are few things that are more off-putting than to see a husband remind his wife in public, you're supposed to be in subjection to me. I see that, and I've seen it too many times in my life, and my first reaction is, man, I want to punch that guy in the throat. I haven't done it yet, but you know what they say about as you get older, sometimes you lose some of those filters. So husbands, don't be going around telling your wife in public she needs to be in subjection. I may not be able to control myself. They share a mutual love and a mutual respect arranged by God's design. This isn't Paul just pulling things out of thin air. This is God's design. This kind of love will often put its desires and wishes ahead of his own. I think of God. In 1 Samuel chapter 8, when the people wanted a king to be like the nations around them, God knew better, didn't he? And yet he said to Samuel what? Let them have it. God acquiesced to their desire. Did he quit loving her that day? No. Still loved. As with the husband who loves his wife will often acquiesce or give in to the wishes and the desires ahead of his own. From something as simple as what color the new car would be, to what the house might be, to how to raise the kids. To me, you go back to Ephesians 5 and verse 21 when Paul says, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. The husband-wife relationship falls into that same thing, and this is very close to that mutual submission to one another. And it comes from a wife's respect for her husband and a husband's love for his wife. They work hand in hand to build the relationship that God has designed. What about the second pair? The second pair is parents and children. Again, with the weaker ones first, or the ones in submission. Children, obey. In Ephesians, Paul, I think, has young children in view because he says, bring them up in the discipline and the instructions of the Lord, Ephesians 6 and verse 4. But here that limitation may not apply. Rather, children of any age that are part of the household, even married children that are living in the household of the father, if they are not living, if they're living there, they would be in the same obedient relationship to the parents. Now, obviously, if they're outside of the household, this would take on somewhat limited application. But unlike the secular codes, Paul addresses children as independent people with responsibilities. They're not just there. They're not just decorations of the home. They have obligations as well. Submission is a general term for recognizing authority, but submission may take the form of obedience, and that's certainly what we're talking about here. Maybe not for the spouses, that would be inappropriate, but for the children's role, they are to have this obedient attitude toward their parents. Children who obey, he says, please the Lord. Again, Jesus is the touchstone for obedience. In the parallel of Ephesians 6 and verse 1, Paul says that such obedience is right. Right living always pleases God. But on the other hand, fathers, do not provoke. And again, it's in the imperative. Fathers can refer to either parent, and definitely has application to fathers and mothers, though fathers may be specifically in view, I think, in this passage, because they function as the head of the home. The secular codes focus on obedient households, but only, again, the New Testament Christianity recognizes the stronger's obligation to the weaker, the parent's obligation to the children. Fathers must not embitter their children, treat them in such a way that provokes rebellion to Christ. Think about rebellion in Deuteronomy 21 and 20, the result of embittered children and what that would mean. N.T. Wright, I think, had a great comment on this. He said, the parent's duty is, in effect, to live out the gospel to the child. That is, to assure their children that they are loved and accepted and valued for who they are. Get this, not for who they ought to be, should have been, or might, if only they would try a little harder, become. Now, how often do our children think that our love for them is conditioned upon how well they meet our expectations? I'm sure many of us have had expectations for our children that were not met. And yet we continue to love our children, don't we? But is it possible that the way we treat our children and encourage them and push them toward that vision that we have of them, that our children feel that that love is conditioned upon meeting that goal? Is that possible? I think that's exactly what Paul is saying. That is possible. And what he's telling us as parents is to live Christ toward our children. Make sure that they know they are loved, even if they don't attain our expectations. May refer to a parent's refusal to allow children to be people in their own right instead of trying to make a carbon copies of themselves. Or sometimes as parents, what we couldn't accomplish ourselves, we push our children to accomplish in our absence or lack. That constant harping and nagging and criticism leads to, as Paul says, discouraged children. They become discouraged, dispirited kids. And we've seen them walking around with their parents at Walmart. But what about that last relationship? Master and slave? When it says, for example, in verse 22, slaves, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters. not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ, for the wrongdoer will be paid back for the wrong he has done. There is no partiality. I think sometimes when we read passages like this, we immediately apply American slave traditions to the first century Roman world. And what that does is it stifles any understanding of Paul's instructions to the slave. For example, when we think about slavery, we think that that in the American South of the antebellum days, that it was everywhere, but it wasn't. There was actually very few families that had the large plantations that had those many slaves. There were many more families that were subsistent farmers at best, barely making a living and had no means to have a slave. In fact, the Roman world had more slaves than the history of the United States. Oftentimes we think that we apply what we have from our history here in America of owners with whips and chains and out there beating their slaves, where in the Roman world it was very common for the master of the slave to work right alongside the slave himself. And it wasn't just an agrarian slavery. All of the guilds of the first century had masters and slaves, and many of them were working alongside one another. The shoemaker, for example, might have a slave, and he would teach that slave, as if that were his own child, the craft and the trade of making shoes. Then they would spend hours each day working side by side, turning out shoes, or clothes, or shields, or swords, or whatever was needed, or whatever their trade might have been. We think of slavery oftentimes as oppressive and forced labor. But you have to understand, slavery of that type that was here in America is not what characterized slavery throughout history. Oftentimes, slaves volunteered for service because it offered a better standard of living than they could have done on their own. To join yourself to a household that was wealthy, to take care of them, ensured that you had food, clothing, and shelter, probably a better bed, greater opportunity for family than out there on your own. And so a lot of times slavery was volunteer. When we think of slavery in the United States, we applaud the abolitionists, and rightfully so, because that form of slavery was very abusive. And the best thing that could happen was liberation from that standard of slavery. But understand, in the first century Roman world, liberation wasn't obviously good. To be liberated from a household often meant the responsibilities of life fell upon the person or the individual. Many of them would turn to homelessness and starvation and death. And so liberation under the first century wasn't necessarily an obviously good thing. In the first century, it wasn't based on race. It had nothing to do with race as it did in our country. And from everything that we can see in the writings, secular writings of the first century, second century, there was no common solidarity among slaves to rise up and be free. Most of them recognized that their lives were good, if not better, than anything they could ever do. So when we go to the first century slave terms, bond servant, as some translations have, we look at that, and if we apply the history of American slavery to first century Rome, then we'll misunderstand the point that Paul is making here. Paul addresses slaves I love this because he expects them to be a part of the church and present when the letter is read. Think about that. Think about the difference of how slaves were treated in the early parts of American history. They would have never sat on the same pew with their owners at church, would they? And yet there's an expectation from Paul that when this letter is read, those slaves would be sitting right next to their masters. That they would have been worshiping God together. And he gives the extended motivation for the slaves to obey. Notice, it's the longest motivation given. They obey with full sincerity, and he says, why? Because you're fearing the Lord. Not the minimum to avoid rebuke. You know, you don't obey just to avoid rebuke from your master. You obey because you fear God. He goes on in verse 23 that no job is too small and not worth full attention because it is, why? For the Lord. In verse 24, you will receive the inheritance from the Lord. Even if you're slighted by your earthly master, your true inheritance, the inheritance, as Paul says, is from the Lord. In verse 24, he says, the work that you do serves the Lord. And in verse 25, when he says that the wrongdoer will be paid back for the wrong he has done, this is not an encouragement to the slave. If your master treats you bad, he's going to be dealt with by God. This is, if you as a slave misbehave, you will be dealt with by God. But notice the common element through those verses. Fearing the Lord, for the Lord, from the Lord, serve the Lord, by the Lord. All of a sudden, we recognize that our service to others is service to God. Jesus tells us as much, doesn't he? As much as you've done it unto one of the least of these, you've done it unto me. The idea of one person owning another is repugnant. And certainly the early church was moving in the ultimate direction, I think, to end carnal slavery. But Paul does not necessarily endorse the institution, but rather all he's giving here is regulations for the institution of slavery. And then he turns around and he says, masters, chapter 4 and verse 1, treat your slaves. Again, the imperative. Treat your slaves. It's an imperative duty to treat their slaves with respect and dignity. Something that was missing in American historic slavery. Why doesn't Paul call for their liberation? Masters, release your slaves. It's because Paul actually calls for a duty that is higher than mere emancipation. He demands a new relationship built upon respect and equality and love. This is obviously good for them. It's good for human dignity. It's good for the common faith. It is good for the fellowship. To where simple liberation was not necessarily good. To liberate a slave didn't mean you had to treat him with respect. It didn't mean that you had to see him as equality. It didn't mean that you had to show him love of any kind. You just kicked him out of the house. That's not what Paul calls for, is it? He calls for that dignity and respect and love from the master to the slave. The secular codes would have instructed masters to treat their slaves so as to make them the most profitable to themselves and to the community. But Paul's instructions lead masters to view their slaves as equal, both honoring the master, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. Pattern your treatment of your slaves the way your master treats you. Whatever role, then, a Christian finds himself or herself, at home or at work, life can and must be lived for the Lord and in harmony with one's fellow human beings. I love this because it's not just a pattern for the home, but this respect, this dignity, this honor, this love that begins in the home and is patterned in the lives of husbands and wives and parents and children and masters and slaves will so permeate those lives that as they go out into the community, that same human dignity and respect and love for their fellow man will be shown daily with those that they interact with. The rules which facilitate the household rules creates true freedom. The application of the Christ effect results in the Christ home. From the institution of the family comes the power and the opportunity to transform society. Today, how does this apply? We look at the world and we wring our hands and we say, oh, we're uncouth, we can't get along, you can't have discussions, everyone's shouting everyone else down. And the answer is not deleting Twitter accounts or suspending Facebook accounts. The answer is not news bites and what channels you watch or where you get your news from. The answer is already in your hands. It is the power of the gospel to change you and your family. And that will change the world. So the question falls on our hearts. Has the good news of Christ permeated deeply? Has it broken down our barriers? Has it destroyed the heart of stone and received the heart of flesh by the grace of God? Maybe this morning you're outside of Christ. And the gospel message, that sounds good to you. And you say, I want to be a part of that. I want to have Christ in my home. But it begins with Christ in your life. And if you've never accepted Him into your life through obeying the gospel, then this morning you have the opportunity to come believing in Him and His power. Changing from the I'm in control to Christ is in control. That's repentance. Confessing Him as Lord in your life before witnesses and being baptized for the remission of your sins. That's how you invite Christ into your life. That's how He comes into your home. And through us, that's how He gets into the world. If you're ready to make that change, we invite you to come while we stand and while we sing this invitation song.